So I'll go ahead and introduce ourselves. I'm Peter Schwartz. I'm the director of the Iowa Center for Bioethics. I'm here to welcome you to the next of our TREATS talks, Translational Research Ethics Applied Topics. TREATS talks are a production of the Bioethics and Subject Advocacy program of the Indiana CTSI. And we do them monthly, or now actually it's going to be a little more like bi-monthly, but we'll go back to monthly hopefully soon. And these are meant to be introductory, 30-minute presentations or shorter on a key topic that researchers may face in ethics and translational research. And they're recorded and archived. Our archive is currently down due to a horrible web accident, which we are working to correct. But these are all recorded and put on the archive for people to access in just-in-time fashion. So I'm going to introduce Mary Ott, who's a professor of pediatrics at Iowa School of Medicine, and even more importantly, a longtime member of the Bioethics Subject Advocacy program. And she'll be giving a talk which I've been begging for years now, and now we get about distinguishing between quality improvement and research. I'll hand it over to the wonderful Professor Ott.
So thank you, everyone. And I am talking about QI because as an ethicist, it's my most common curbside consult, where if I'm talking to fellows or residents or postdocs about research, in the behavioral research realm, they'll say, well, I'm doing this QI project. I don't know whether I should submit it or whether I need to submit it, and what I do with it. And so I thought, well, let's look at these issues around QI, the ethical issues, the overlaps and distinctions between QI and research. And I want to give, and so my talk is built around a set of key questions, if I can move the slides forward.
That would be nice. It does work.
It does work.
What will it be next?
But how do I distinguish QI from research is the first question, and that's sort of the practical question for researchers. But then as I started to dive into distinguishing QI from research, I realized there really wasn't much of a distinction. So I want to talk and move forward and talk about the problems with applying our current ethical and regulatory framework to QI. And then talk about some alternative, or what I think are perhaps more appropriate ethical frameworks for QI. So one is sort of a practical approach to QI and research, but 2 and 3 are really, let's sort of push the issue and think about what are the underlying ethics and how do we want to think about QI going forward. So I'm going to start with some definitions. So quality improvement has been defined as a systematic, formal approach to the analysis of practice performance and efforts to improve performance. And the key piece is the focus on performance and improvement of performance. So this is like a quality improvement focuses on practice. Research, in contrast, also systematic, but research has been defined by OHRP as a systematic investigation, including research development, testing, and evaluation designed to develop and contribute to generalized knowledge. So the key piece about research that people have honed in on is this issue of generalized knowledge. And I'm going to bring to you a little case that just came up last month. One of the fellows I was working with approached me about a QI project. She's working with a new adolescent clinic in Kenya, and they're having a lot of difficulty getting their adolescent HIV patients on contraception and family planning. It's a huge issue because unintended pregnancy among young women with HIV can really be devastating both to the young mother's health, to the infant's health, and to the infant's health. So the fellow's planning a QI project in which she puts together a team within the clinic. They brainstorm barriers and test solutions using the PDSA approach, Plan, Do, Study, Act. That is a common technique in QI projects. And it turns out, like, globally, there's a lot of interest in implementation approaches to adolescent family planning. Like, we know family planning works with teens. We know if we can get young women on contraception, we can delay childbirth, reduce maternal morbidity, improve both physical and socioeconomic outcomes for the young women. So the question is really, how do you implement family planning? So her colleagues in other countries and other places globally are really interested in their approach. And so she's planning on presenting the research at a professional conference and writing up on it as a journal. So her first question was, well, is this research or is it QI? So, and we could even do, so we have enough people in the room to take a vote, actually. I wasn't sure we'd be able to take a vote. But who votes for research? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, it's unanimous. Except for me. So it's not quite unanimous, this is almost unanimous.
This is why we need this.
Yeah. So these are pieces of what she did. She was over there and was texting me back because it was super cool. It worked really well. But they started with a problem statement. So poor uptake of family planning services among HIV patients at the Rafiki Center of Excellence in Adolescent Health. They did something called a fishbone diagram where you look at all the different, you make it like a fishbone where you take all the different areas where there might be barriers, identify those barriers, and then identify potential solutions. And she used a plan, do, study, act approach. So they took one piece of their fishbone, implemented that piece of their fishbone, and then are looking to see are the number of kids, is the uptake of family planning higher. So now I ask, is this QI or is this research?
We went very fast. What was the intervention?
I can't remember what they did they did sort of like some, like there were, so it's progressed along. One of the interventions was educating clinic staff in confidentiality and educating clinic staff in contraception. Another intervention was having the nurse who's an expert in contraception automatically meet with every kid between a certain age range. So they had a series of interventions that they did as part of this.
I have another clarification question before answering. Does anybody have a question before answering?
And can't it be both?
Yeah, so maybe, yeah, sure.
If they hope to improve both their own program, but also provide a framework by which others could improve their program.
Yeah, so I'm gonna say, so can't it be both is I think a really important observation, and I'm gonna have you hold that because we're gonna talk about like the either or approach.
Okay, sure.
So this project actually is a really nice example of QI methodologies. And in contrast, research methodologies are quite different. And I just sort of threw up the hierarchy of evidence where you start out with in vitro, go to animal studies, case reports, case controlled and cohort studies, controlled, randomized controlled trials, and then systematic reviews and meta-analyses. And these involve like systematic study, they involve comparison groups, they involve sampling. So the methods that are typically used in research, one thing is that these are a little bit different than the methods used in QI. And so, like, thinking about this distinction between research and QI, and I have to say our IU, Human Subjects Office, has done a great deal of work on this, and they have this really nice tool on their website. So for anyone actually doing QI-oriented work or comparative effectiveness research, I would strongly recommend logging on to our IU HSO website and looking at the toolkits that they provide. Also using our HSO staff to run by questions about, is this QI, is this research? But so our IU HSO definitions are based upon federal definitions, and they define quality improvement as data collection or analysis for internal operating and operation monitoring and program improvement. And so in this case, the key issue is internal. And they said that the data could be originally collected for other purposes. So in the QI project that we were talking about for adolescent contraception, they did a chart review and just looked at whether the young person had contraception on their medication list and as a question on their charts. You can also use QI data for oral and written communication that's done specifically for that purpose. QI can also be implementation of an accepted practice to improve delivery or quality of services, and this includes both education and training as well as clinical care. So the key piece of this is an accepted practice, so an intervention that's already been studied, and you're looking at the actual implementation part of it, so you can alter the use of an accepted practice and collect data to evaluate its effect. And they emphasize that it's not designed to contribute to generalizable knowledge. So, this is our IU HSO definition, and it's helpful when you're looking at your project and thinking, is this QI or is this research? Less helpful if is it both? You hit the raise the hand button.
As much as you're going to build it, you can't wave a hand. So, without that, I can't do it. So, you can hold this question, but it seems like that last bullet point is the one that we were all relying on in voting the one way, which is that although all that other stuff was true and it was like quality improvement all the way through, you then said that she was thinking about presenting this and writing a paper perhaps. So now it looked like that last bullet point would not apply, and that would sink the definition of this as quality improvement makes it good. But you can hold off on that, but that is usually what we go to when we get consensus on this. Yeah.
So the other interesting thing is that this is a specific place and time in Kenya.
Yes.
And so does that mean it's less generalizable? It is maybe generalizable to East Africa or to the IUF program or something like that, but maybe not in the true definition of QI. You know, I'm not much in research, so I don't know.
I think it's actually good to answer this, because this generalizable comment is one that is the one most heavily relied on, but it's one of these comments that feels like it's really obvious, but when you start thinking through what makes something generalizable and what makes something not generalizable, then it sort of questions our underlying assumptions. So I think this idea that this is done, like this intention, that this is in a specific context, in a specific clinic with a specific group of providers, like you saw that fishbone diagram, I mean, you couldn't read all the details, but one of the issues is that one of their clinical officers came from the little kid pediatrics end rather than the adult medicine end, so was less comfortable talking about reproductive health. So one of their interventions had to do with clinical officers who see the patients, increasing their understanding and comfort level with asking questions. So very specific to the location, time, place, and individuals involved. Other parts are not so specific. Another thing on their thing was adding a question on their forms says, when was your last period and have you ever had sex? Because when they did their initial chart review, they didn't know whether or not the young woman had any periods, and if so, when was her last one, and whether or not that they had sex. So these are seem two key elements, questions, and we know from research on provider prompts that if you put the prompt onto the form, whether it be electronic or paper, providers are more likely to ask it. So one of their interventions was putting a prompt on the form, which is this sort of very generalizable thing. I mean, I've seen it done in children's hospitals here in the U.S. So, this idea of, but the particulars are really important, and the intent is important, and we'll talk about intent. So this is the IU HSO, one of their tools to distinguish research in QI. A key piece is intent. And so and this is Meg's comment on the particulars, their intervention and their project was really focused on particulars, as opposed to coming up with a generalizable approach that could be used anywhere. But the question, becomes in this particular case, using a QI methodology, looking at the particulars and addressing the particular, then a generalizable approach. Is there a QI approach to improving adolescent contraception, then sort of generalizable to other low and middle income contexts. So the intent would be this idea of generalizable knowledge versus improvement of a practice, process, service at a specific institution. Design-wise, we talked a little bit about it. Research frequently involves randomization and comparison groups, but for people that do behavioral research, it might be along the spectrum. So you have qualitative work that really doesn't involve randomization and comparison groups. QI in contrast involves improvement cycles, but may involve comparison groups or randomization. I mean, if we think about like the QI and comparative effectiveness research projects that engendered the storm of interest in the ethics around QI and consent, they were surgical checklists where they used a clustered randomized design where they had centers doing surgical checklists and centers not doing surgical checklists. So they used a sophisticated study design, had randomization and had comparison groups, but it was like essentially a quality improvement issue. Does using a surgical checklist help with post-surgical outcomes at their centers, in their system? So population, frequently in research, you'll be using a subset of the broader population. If you're thinking about it as generalizable to all adolescents, you're going to use a subset of adolescents and provide some sort of statistical and sampling justification. Whereas QI, you'll get most or all of the young people getting the treatment program or processes. So Catherine looked at the last 50 patients that they served in their clinic to see whether they had whatever intervention, whether they'd been asked about sex and whether they had any uptake of contraception. We can think about effects. So for research, the intent is usually not to directly affect the practice where you're at, but it might affect it, as opposed to directly informing practices and policies. From a benefit perspective, participants may or may not receive direct benefits from research. So if we think about, hypertension trials, or depending on which group you're randomized to, you might or might not see a benefit. This contrasts to the children's oncology group, where almost every child, like over 80%, are on a clinical trial. So kids, they use this sort of research is integrated into treatment. For QI, participants in practices usually directly benefit. Dissemination for research is expected, where you would expect people to present and publish. For QI, it's not assumed, and when it is presented, they want to suggest effective models, strategies, assessment tools, benchmarks, things like that. So this is our tool, and these are sort of thinking about like what are the differences. So if you practice QI, I found this really helpful. Some of my projects are more QI oriented, where we take when we're looking at adolescent sex education, we take an evaluated effective program implemented in a community and look at whether we see change in relevant indicators that the program affects, like communication with parents. So, there are things that are more QI oriented, things that are more research oriented, and this is a tool for investigators. And if you feel like yours is somewhere in between, you can call up our IRB, talk to one of a member of the HSO staff, and they have people there that have some expertise in determining QI versus research and regulatory oversight.
And bring it back to the question you can refuse to answer. As your constitutional right.
I will answer it eventually.
So I understand that this is a nice set of distinguishing characteristics. There are two ways you might use it. I wonder if you can direct this use of the tool for the HSO person who's helping you or yourself. One would be if any of the lines checks off on research, then you're in the research world. Certainly that last line of the first one, right? So like you're planning publication, you're planning presentation, you're planning to, it's not that, the overall, all of them have to be considered. But if one line tips you over research, then you're in research. Here's a second question about applying it. For any one of the lines, is your question sort of how strong is either side? Is that sort of the question? Like, let's say presentation, like in the case you gave, presentation publication is assumed, but that's not the main reason why you're doing it. Is that enough? The true fact that wasn't the main reason they were doing it. Is that enough to keep it on the QI side? Is that key to the case you're saying it being QI? Is that although they were planning to present, that wasn't the reason they were going to do it? Now that's an interesting philosophical distinction if we can really know the real reason why we do things. But is that what the defense of that case being QI is going to depend on? Because they do plan presentation publication.
Yeah, so I'm gonna table the intent for 2 slides or 3 slides because I'm gonna address it, because I think intent is really, really important. And so I'm gonna, and Catherine's is really a nice example of QI intent, where it was really focused on the particulars of this population in this location at this time. So the intent is one. The other thing is how to use these checklists, you know, and you're like, if you get 1, do you move over? So there's actually a paper on a checklist that looks very similar to our checklist, and they put forth, if you're anything in the research column, you should be considered research. I personally am not sure I agree with that, because I think that there are really good QI projects that do use randomization, like the surgical checklist. Like, imagine if you had to get, as you were implementing surgical checklists, you had to get individual patient consent for every single checklist. You know, they did have a comparison group, and they did use randomization. They used an alternative trial design with cluster randomization. So, you know, so I would say that there are well-designed QI projects that use techniques that we typically think about as research techniques. On the dissemination, I think it's really an old view that if you disseminate it, it's automatically research. Because I think if you look to the right, like, you know, this idea of having effective models and strategies is really important. It may not be like the particulars of, you know, what the QI project is doing. So for instance, in Western Kenya, what are they doing in terms of what interventions do they choose? But the model of taking the individuals in the clinic, getting representation from all the professionals involved in the clinic, from educators to nursing to medical personnel, and then and so that the publication would be focused on this approach and disseminating this approach to increasing family planning uptake, which doesn't make it not QI, you know. So and I think you can assume publication because it's a really important issue. I mean, maternal morbidity is one of the biggest killers of young girls internationally. And so this is, and contraception is one of the most effective ways of reducing maternal morbidity. So, so she is like, the plan to publish is actually quite reasonable. So here, she wants to publish it. And asked 2 colleagues whether QI has to have ethics committee or IRB approval, and neither of them was me. I was just there. And so this is the QI. So colleague 1 says if her QI results are of publishable quality, then she could ask for approval for secondary data analysis after the project is completed. And colleague 2 said absolutely not. Who's right?
What is LMIC?
Oh, low and middle income countries.
You're asking if?
Colleague 1 or colleague 2, who is right?
Yeah.
There are 2 correct answers to this. Yeah, let's take a vote. Colleague 1 right. Colleague 2 right. Or neither right.
Is anyway, nobody's voting.
Or both right.
D and not D.
And then I thought I was going to say, are they both right? And then I thought if they're both right, then neither is right, because if they're both, I like caught in one of those armchair philosophical discussions with myself, which is really dangerous. So IRB and ethics committee oversight. So for publication and funding. So journals and funding, I put often require, but my recent experience is 100% of the journals that I have put my work in have required documentation of IRB oversight or a determination by the IRB that oversight is not required. So they want me to have submitted my project to the IRB for either approval or determination that it's QI and therefore oversight is not required. And so funders also require documentation of IRB oversight. So I have, I have a grant where the funding hasn't yet been released yet because we're working through IRB approval, and the money will come once they get IRB approval. So, so it is an issue, a practical issue here. So our health human subjects office has something called an application for non-human subjects research. And that application is, you can submit it and they'll determine whether IRB oversight is or is not required. And then that will generate an IRB number and IRB documentation that it's been submitted, and you would do this beforehand. So this is something that our IRB does, and I have done it and found it incredibly helpful because it made me as an investigator really consider, like, what are the issues, what's the intent, what are the publication pieces, what are the, you know, so like sort of work through, like, is this project in the right bucket? The other thing I would say, because we're talking about, my example was from an international project. Regulations are country specific, and international researchers need to check on both ends.
And so if there's a conflict between the two different countries?
You probably would go with the one that's more restrictive. Like that would be just as a pragmatic thing, you know. So intent, so I tabled intent. So intent is really important. It does matter for ethics committee and IRB approval. Is the intent to improve processes in your system, or is the intent to produce generalizable knowledge? So does Catherine, does this QI project want to just improve uptake of family planning at the Rafiki Center for Excellence in Adolescent Health, or do they want to produce a reproducible approach that you can pick up and plop down anywhere? So intent is really important. So the other intent question was intent, does intent to publish make it research?
No, I mean, you just said.
Yeah, no, like this is the thing, is like, no, it doesn't anymore. Like intent, we have whole journals of QI. You know, there's intent to publish alone doesn't make it research. Intent to produce generalizable knowledge makes it research. Your intent about your main purpose in doing it, is it focused on your system and improving your system versus improving your improving like as something that is like going to be more like you can pull it out of your system and put it anywhere. And you know, there's a range here and there's huge amounts of overlap. So this is one of my concerns about generalizability, because QI can be generalized if the contexts are correct. It's like with qualitative work, like qualitative work isn't generalizable in the sense that it's generally done with a homogeneous population where you're trying to understand the range and depth of opinion in that population, but you can take it and apply it to other similar populations. So it's the same issue that comes up with QI and qualitative work. So this generalizable piece is problematic, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But it's really this intent, is your intent to improve your system? And one of the questions I ask is, would you, and one of the questions that was asked of the person that had done the QI project in Kenya was like, will you do the project even if you couldn't get, even if it was not publishable? And like her answer was absolutely yes, this needs to get done. It's really primarily focused. If it will have achieved its goal if it never gets published or presented anywhere.
Yeah. One thing that I'm a little just, I don't know, maybe it's like splitting hairs too much, but the funny thing is for me about intent is that it strikes me that to some extent, and maybe it's because I'm just not in the same research world that you all are in, but like to some extent, any type of research in a way would be quality improvement. Just if I'm trying a new surgery, like a type of surgery, it's because I want to improve the outcome for this individual. So like, to me, there's almost like what makes it quality improvement is that it feels like quality improvement, which is completely unhelpful. It's just funny to me how like,
it's like the Supreme Court's definition of pornography.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
I just want to know if that was.
I promise I didn't plant your comment there, but because I think you bring up a really key point, is that where we're going as a healthcare in endeavor is towards these learning healthcare systems. So in a learning healthcare system, research and QI are built into the system, and you're always doing it for multiple purposes. The other thing is there's not like buckets of research and buckets of QI. There's sort of a spectrum of things. So, you know, where some things are clearly just QI and some things are purely research, a phase 1 clinical trial, maybe something like that. Although you could even argue that some people sign up for them in the hopes of.
Or someone doing like a very well established clinical, like a very simple surgery that's been, you know, where it's the best practices established, even in a learning healthcare system, that would still be a very clinical application to some extent.
Well, in comparative effectiveness research, we had a case a couple years ago where there was in pediatric urology, there is an approach to a particular problem where in infants they do surgery and in older kids they do robotic. They do open surgery in infants and older kids because they're so tiny. And in older kids, they do robotic surgery. And then there's this like medium-sized kids where it's not clear which is better. And it sort of depends on who you see and what they're more comfortable with, because there was no standard for them. And so they proposed a comparative effectiveness thing because there's no standard. Can you randomize the kids to one or the other? The support trial is in neonatology. Is everybody familiar with the support trial? The comparative effectiveness trial, and I'm trying to remember the numbers, but like, so it turns out that like premature newborns definitely need oxygen, supplemental oxygen, but they don't need too much oxygen. If they don't get enough oxygen, it affects brain development, but if they get too much oxygen, there are like toxicities that are related to high levels of oxygen. And so within the nursery, there was sort of an 8-point range that they would keep the kids' oxygenation. And some people kept it more towards the upper end of the range. Some people kept it more towards the lower end of the range. It was really personal preference of the clinician and style. And there weren't data there. So they randomized the kids within the acceptable best practices range to the upper end versus the lower end. And this trial was done as a comparative effectiveness trial. They got consent. There was consent, you know, but it engendered, it turns out like one of the 2 ranges was actually much better for the kids. And they felt like the consent forms, like looking retrospectively, did the consent forms give full disclosure? I mean, it was really interesting. There was like sort of a storm of concern from regulatory bodies about consent with this. So I think that you know, you're hitting this idea of comparative effectiveness research, like what happens, and it's a nice example of something that sits at the junction of research and QI. So going backwards, so retroactive approval, I mean, you just can't do it. It's not ethical. Like, I did this research study and now I did this thing that I called QI, but really it was research and now I want you to approve it. So the person that said, the colleague that said, no, can't be done is in some sense correct. However, there are situations where you do secondary data analyses of projects utilizing data collected from a QI project. And this may in fact represent human subjects research, and you can at that point apply to analyze it as a secondary data. And again, you get to this issue of intent. If the secondary analysis isn't the primary intent of the program, but you looked at these data that were collected as part of your program evaluation, part of the QI project, and felt, oh, like we could ask some really interesting hypotheses of these data, then you can go back and apply as secondary data analysis. So I think it is, again, it comes to this idea of intent, is this idea of sort of honesty of researchers.
So let me just summarize and see if you agree with my summary of what you're saying. I think I'm repeating what you said. It's very clear. I love this. As long as your primary reason for doing the project is to actually improve quality in the services you're providing, as long as that's your primary reason, even if in the back of your mind you realize someday you may apply for IRB approval to get secondary analysis of the data, even if you realize that's a possibility, maybe even kind of your plan, as long as your primary reason for doing it, the sine qua non, the thing that you're doing it for, is that then you at least have a leg to stand on to say it's still quality improvement.
So, I have to say so I say, yes, it's still quality improvement, but as you're thinking about regulatory oversight, then that is the type of project that I would ask myself one question is, if I couldn't get approval to submit this for publication, would I still do it?
Which is a matter of privacy of
Your interest. And the second thing that I would do is I would strongly recommend talking to the relevant IRB or ethics committee, because when you get to these things that are on the margin, there's a lot of stuff on the margin. You really need their input from a regulatory perspective. So I would say, ask yourself one question and ask the IRB the same question.
So maybe this is just total heresy here. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, but in a sense, what does it matter whether you call it QI or research?
Perfect. Here we go.
So
Yes.
human subject protection,
Yeah.
which I get.
Yeah. No. So here are my ethics concerns with what we're doing now. So it's all or nothing. So there are really high oversight burdens of research, which provide an incentive to redesign QI and comparative effectiveness research such that they're not classified as research. So you get less rigorous sampling, design, and analysis. And I would have to say, from an ethics perspective, one of the first ethics questions we have to ask about research is, should we be doing this research at all with individuals? And if we are, can we do it in the way that is the most scientifically rigorous so that the data that we get is able to that we can use to improve healthcare. So I think that really this oversight, what you end up with is an all or nothing situation, and is particularly problematic in areas like pediatrics or prison research, work with vulnerable populations, because these groups were not considered when they did the new OHRP recommendations. So a lot of things would be in the adult world would be considered exempt, but if you're doing it with a vulnerable population, it's not exempt. So you end up with really high oversight burdens around consent and stuff like that. Protections that are really important if it's like a medication trial of potentially toxic medication. Perhaps less important if you're talking about a clustered randomization of a surgical checklist. There's minimal to no oversight for QI. It's just considered part of practice. So it's not like our HSO office, their charge is human subjects research. We don't have an equivalent QI office. Each individual system has things around QI, and they have some people have QI committees, some people require some organizations require QI to be submitted, but there's no consistency to it. And a lot of QI is just sort of done. So you have minimal to no oversight, and there may be some patient-related risks for QI, and there's issues around accountability. So I think the all or nothing thing really doesn't serve patients, it doesn't serve investigators. So I really have concerns with our current oversight of QI around this. The distinction between QI and research is really, really fuzzy. So we have this idea of generalizability. So I would put forth, clinical trials have highly selected populations treated in controlled conditions that we will never be able to repeat in real life. So is this actually generalizable? Whereas QI is conducted in real world settings with the chaos of clinics. And does that actually make it more generalizable? Is it? And then I would ask, who are you generalizable to whom? So I would say the first QI project that we started with around uptake of contraceptives and family planning, that's the specific actions that they do are not generalizable to individual patients at another place, but the system and their approach is generalizable to other adolescent clinics in sub-Saharan Africa. So taking this approach is generalizable, although the actual choices and things that were done as the specific activities that they came up with as part of their QI project may not be generalizable, or very sort of particular to the location and context. So generalizable, at what level is it generalizable? The rigor So QI can have randomization, comparison groups, use advanced analytic methods. People doing QI have the same desire to reduce error and improve validity as people doing research. And many researchers cross over and do both QI work and research, or do work right at the where the two come together. Then there's the issues around risks and burdens to patients. Like a lot of, it wasn't on my thing, but a lot of groups look at like what's the risk and burden to patients. Like research you assume high risk to patients, high burden, as opposed to QI having like minimal to no burden to patients. But pragmatic research like comparative effectiveness trials oftentimes minimize the risks and burdens, and the risks and burdens aren't any different than what they would get as part of routine clinical care. So I would argue that risks and burdens to patients is also not a way to differentiate QI and research. So arbitrary distinctions. So like funding, plan for publication, and involvement of researchers. These are things that have been proposed as ways to differentiate QI from research, but they're sort of arbitrary and don't have to do with patient well-being. So I think that there's like some of the pieces are arbitrary. And then it's a poor fit for today's ethical needs. Like our current model really grew out of the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects reports of the 1970s, and they were responding to gross negligence and abuses of individuals involved in research. And they make a sharp distinction between research and practice and are highly focused on patient protection and patient rights. And the cornerstone of that is autonomy and like focusing on patient consent and patient understanding of the research process, and not just giving them information, but making sure they understand that information. And in some ways, when we're applying this model, autonomy trumps all. Because you would never, because consent is it's like sort of this cornerstone to it. So that's our current model of oversight. Missing though is what I would consider an equal ethical imperative for a just and equitable healthcare system. So we need a healthcare system where people have access, where there's quality, where there's affordability. The other ethical piece that's really missing, and no offense, Peter, but like the National Commission report was primarily like middle-aged white men making this, and it's very much like we, the physicians and system, and you, the patient, but I would argue that the ethical obligations are bi-directional.
We'll cut out that.
You're not quite middle-aged. So but it's made from this more paternalistic view. So like the patient, but there are obligations from the provider to the patient, but also from the patient to the provider. There are obligations from the system to the patient and the system to the provider. So I think that there are these bi-directional obligations. So that just aren't in there because it's just a very patriarchal, focused on protection approach. So where does it leave us? So oversight, if not the IRB, then whom? And I have to say, I honestly don't have the right answer to that, and it's way beyond this talk. But I mean, thinking about like what cue the ethics, and what I'm going to talk about in my last little bit of time is another ethical framework to start thinking about. So if autonomy, beneficence, and justice, if not those, then what are our ethical obligations? And I think looking at learning healthcare systems for QI is where we need to be from the ethics. So because the goal of a learning healthcare system is a just and equitable healthcare system. In a learning healthcare system is this idea that healthcare systems have an obligation to continuously improve. In that it's acceptable and essential to integrate research and quality improvement approaches into practice. The purpose of a learning healthcare system is to generate and apply the best evidence or the collaborative choices of each patient-provider dyad, to drive the process of discovery as a natural outgrowth of patient care and not something separate from patient care, and to ensure innovation such that we can improve quality, safety, and value in our healthcare system. So this is this idea, this sort of overarching goal of a learning healthcare system. And there has been 7 proposed fundamental ethical obligations of a learning healthcare system, and these actually fit well for QI. So first is respecting the rights and dignity of patients. So this is the autonomy thing, but the idea is that this is one of 7 and it doesn't trump all. So the first thing to ask is, does a QI activity unduly limit the choices of patients or the value of their choices? And if not, then that puts it in, if not and if so, puts it in different buckets, because not all QI activities are attached to a significant autonomy interest. In actually deferring could be a moral failure to care for the patient. So I'm going to go to the surgical checklist, which were phenomenally effective. So if they would not have been able to do this type of comparative effectiveness research with surgical checklists, this is a moral failure to improve the care of our patients. So respecting the rights and dignity is first looking at, like, are we limiting their choices? If not limiting their choices, then, sort of how can we move forward? Respecting clinical judgment is also a core fundamental ethical obligation of the learning healthcare system. I'm not going to talk about this much, it's less related to QI, but I would have to say when QI targets areas of clinical uncertainty or limited evidence, then the likelihood that unrestricted clinician judgment will advance patient interest is lessened. So there may be some wiggle room in this, and I think this is a key piece, is that these are 7 ethical obligations. There's not a single one trumping all. Providing optimal care to each patient. So is the expected net clinical benefit from a QI activity higher than non-participation? This is going to be specific to a QI project's particulars. Avoiding imposing non-clinical risks and burdens. So we have an obligation to incorporate protections to reduce risks and burdens. So this is, again, sort of similar to beneficence and non-maleficence, but putting it into the context of a clinical system and applied to our patient. Addressing unjust inequalities. This is where we get to system level ethical obligations, and where QI, because QI functions at the level of a system. So, our current regulations focus on fair subject selection and just distribution of research risk and benefit. But I would argue that we actually have an affirmative obligation for QI to reduce or eliminate inequities in evidence available for clinical decision making and inequities in healthcare delivery. So we have market inequities, and this is something that our system is really ethically obligated to address. So we're ethically obligated to target disparities in clinical outcomes. Conducting QI to continuously improve the quality of clinical care and healthcare systems. So we have, like, basically what this 7 fundamental ethical obligations is saying is we actually, as professionals, are morally obligated to perform QI, to integrate learning into our healthcare system. And finally, is this bidirectionality. So there's an obligation of patients to contribute to the common purpose of improving quality and value of healthcare. So just as systems and professionals have obligations to patients, patients have an obligation to contribute to and participate in QI. And it's this norm of common purpose. So this is my one piece of philosophy in here. So Rawls' principle of the common good is sort of adapted to this norm of common purpose, that we want to create we all have a common purpose, professional systems and patients, to create a healthcare system that has high quality, efficient, effective, affordable. And this is Hume's obligations of reciprocity. If I receive the benefit of society, I should promote its interests. And I'm going to close on that with, like, another way to say it, which is my favorite Muhammad Ali quote is, service to others is the rent you pay for your room here on earth. And so I think, what I'm going to propose is that these 7 that when we're thinking about the ethics of QI, we sort of move away from autonomy, beneficence, justice, and really think about these 7 obligations of a learning healthcare system, because QI is really an essential part of a learning healthcare system. So I'm open for questions.
Okay, once again, Advocate speaks. Mary, I love the reframing of the redirecting. The last piece, though, even though I personally am in agreement with it and would feel comfortable if I were the patient, if I am the physician or the researcher, I would not be comfortable with you're not forcing, but you're assuming or expecting the patient who is sick and not in an equal relationship. I agree, we had bidirectional, but it was not an equality. And so it just makes me nervous to say that that's an expectation for a patient within a learning healthcare system. Although, like I said, if I'm the patient, I would hope I would just jump right out and say, yeah, take my blood.
Yeah, but I would say that there's checks and balances here, because they also have an obligation to reduce, to respect the rights and the dignity of the patient. And if it's something that, and that's really sort of, if this is something where you can't respect the rights and dignity of the patient, then you really shouldn't be able to do it. And we have this obligation to do what's best. So the physicians actually have 6 obligations and the patients just have 1 obligation. But there's sort of checks and balances to the point.
Yeah, I see it and I accept it. I guess I'm just wondering if it might be helpful to add a little phrase in that number 7.
Yeah.
Acknowledging that within the in an acknowledgement of the previous 6
things, yes,
to the
yeah.
extent possible, something
Yeah, and I think that they had made it number 7 because you really have to meet 1 through 6 before you get to number 7.
Yeah.
The other piece is I think that there's more and more individuals that are like yourself. So Nancy Cass's group was looking at alternative consent methods for comparative effectiveness research in QI. And they did a public deliberation where people are educated about the topic for a couple days, and then they're asked to weigh in and consider, given a series of questions. And what they were asked about is what types of consent approaches for comparative effectiveness research would be acceptable to them. One of them was just being told that comparative effectiveness research was going on in the clinic, not an individual interaction with their provider, but just, here's our approach to HIPAA, here's our approach to this, and we have these particular comparative effectiveness studies going on so that you know about them. Another approach was opt out. So we have these studies, you have an individual discussion, you can opt out if you want, but if you don't opt out, we're going to have you go forward and be a part of the study. The third was an opt-in, where you would go through more of a traditional consent process. And not surprising, people favored opt-in over opt-out over general, but the people favoring it was 70, it was 80%, no, what was it, 70% favored opt-in, 65 favored opt-out. So really similar, this opt-in versus opt-out, and 40% would found that in certain contexts, it would be acceptable to just do a general, this is what's going on, which is, really these data are really interesting, these data from individuals who, presumably they've been sort of, educated about what's involved in comparative effective research and pragmatic trials. And it was limited to this thing, but it was Geisinger Medical Group and the University Medical Group. And so 2 really different, very sort of generalizable groups of people. But I think your point is well taken. But I think that it's also a piece that's been missing in research and in QI and in healthcare systems in general.
So I want to ask about this episode at the end applies to the Kenya case.
Yeah.
So a conclusion I guess I would take is that researchers should always be trying to publicize any sort of QI stuff as much as they can. So it'd be great to have the rigors of research with the oversight of QI. Like that'd be the ideal system. Is that the right takeaway or?
I think so right now there's no oversight of QI. So I have to say that, you know, and so what I'm proposing is more that we rethink oversight in terms of QI and include these principles in the oversight. And these principles would allow more flexibility than research oversight. I mean, so that would be my proposal for it, but it's just, I don't know that, I mean, QI is so particular and systems are so particular in and of themselves. I'm not sure, I mean, that's sort of a separate talk is like, how would you even do, like, what are the pragmatic issues in QI oversight? I'd be interested to hear what Regan Street does for it. Is there
I'm
oversight?
working on individual projects,
Yeah.
so we have programmatic oversight.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is, and that would be sort of what's best practices for QI right now is the organization takes over the oversight and make sure that patients' dignity and rights are respected and make sure that the methods are rigorous, make sure, you know, so I think, you know, as opposed to like if it's something like that would fall into the research bucket, we have like sort of federally mandated IRBs and international research ethics committees that would do it. Any other questions? Okay, thank you all.
Hi, Andrew, if you're still there.